next speaker is a leader in the Lynn Stewart Defense Committee and the New Abolitionist Movement. He's been a long-time activist involved in a huge array of movements. He's Ralph Poynter.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'm here to give you a view of what social change was about, what the 60s were about, through the eyes of Lynn Stewart. And it's encouraging being here, looking at the faces that I see. The young, eager, courageous faces, not afraid to use terms such as socialism. And it's become a dirty word in America. The idea of an inclusive America is a dirty word. But there were people in the 60s who were unafraid to say these words. And one of the people was Lynn Stewart, a young woman who I met in 1962 in the New York City public schools. Now, I was older. I had come from Pittsburgh as a teacher, lived in western Pennsylvania, coal mine, steel. My father was a union organizer. He took me to my first union meeting at 5 years old. Now, you have to understand what it was like then to understand how the 60s came about, to understand where we are now, and to understand how we're going to get to where we've got to go. And that's a lot to talk about in 10 minutes, as I was told. I guess I'm about 8 minutes, so I'm going to take some shortcuts. In those days, to go to a union meeting, just to go to a meeting, you had to be prepared for violence. Your family had to be prepared for violence. And when my father said he was taking me to a meeting, my mother said no. But in front of the neighborhood, I had to prove that I could run down the street with him holding on to his pants and make the distance. And when I did, the whole neighborhood cheered, because here was another union member, because I ran the race with him. And many, many years later, after the Korean War, there was an event held by the Chinese-American Friendship Committee. And a gentleman named Jimmy Veneers, who had served in Korea at the end of the war, after his education in a Chinese war camp, decided to go to China instead of coming to America. Because he had learned in the Chinese war camp, prisoner of war camp, what capitalism was all about. And naturally, getting to this meeting at Riverside Church, I was late, and I was attending with Lynn Stewart, and Jimmy stopped his speech and says, "Wait a minute, I think I see someone I know." And he says, "The story goes, I went up the street in this small town, and the black organizer who lived in the neighborhood was out at a union meeting, and I opened up the front door, and the woman sitting there with her children around her threw the newspaper aside and pointed a pistol at me, and he said, 'Stop, it's me, Miss Poynter, Jimmy.' And the reason for that is if you dare go to a union meeting, they would terrorize your home, your family, your children." And he says, "I think I see the youngest child walk in there." It was me. And I remember the last thing that Jimmy had said to me when he left town, I was about 14, he says, "Keep fighting them. Don't allow them to intimidate you." And in those days, we're talking about the 50s, you couldn't sit in a restaurant. You couldn't sit in a coffee shop. You couldn't use a restroom. You couldn't go to a bowling alley. I went everywhere. And I challenged everybody to a fight. And this was the way I lived. And his words were, "Don't stop being who you are. Challenge them at every time." Now, I say all of that to say this. When I met Lynn Stewart in 1962, she was 21 years old. She was born not 5 miles from home And she didn't know Harlem existed. She was an honor student in every class. Her mother didn't understand the B. And she'd gone on to Hope College. And in Hope College, she began to get a taste of what America was all about. Because as head of the Spanish Club, she gave a Christmas party for the children of the migrant workers, the Mexican migrant workers in Michigan. And she was brought on the carpet for that. And it influenced her. And she told me, she says, I couldn't understand these Christians, fundamentalist Christians, brought me on the carpet for having a pre-Christmas party for the children of immigrants. She says her eyes opened. She never went back to Hope College. She stayed in New York and graduated from a local college, Wagner, on Richmond, Staten Island. And then she got a job in Harlem. But to her surprise, this black community, consequential issues, isn't going to get it. We have to be willing to pay the consequence for what we do. And I'm not talking about Martin Luther King, nonviolent resistance, because I'm very clear, nonviolent resistance is no resistance at all. I've been around a long time, and if somebody doesn't respect you for who you are, and what may happen to them, you've got no respect. And one of the differences in today and what we went through in the 60s is they didn't have black water. Suppose they bring black water home. Now, as all you people have mentioned here, what they do there, they're going to do here. What they did in Iraq, they're going to bring here. What they do in Colombia, they're going to bring here. And we must be prepared to deal with it. But first off, we must be prepared to understand and to say what we mean so that others around us will not be frightened, that we will be the example and they can join around us. And we had a great teacher in the 60s. Her name was Queen Mother Moore. She had worked in the black liberation struggle over the years. And the message, and we used to sit at her feet, and the message she would bring, there is no freedom of the press unless you own the press. There's no freedom of assembly unless you own the place of assembly, unless you have your own halls. There is no law unless you're willing to defend the laws that you claim that you support. Now, Lynn Stewart learned this. It was a great period of the 60s. It was an educational period. You were able to sit and talk with people as you are doing today, people from various struggles. But one of the things that we failed to realize in the 60s, that everyone's struggle was ours. It was into the 80s when we started saying, all of us or none of us. Well, I hear it being said here. You are ahead of us. And what is the prerequisite to the 60s, when everyone was in a movement? Well, the 50s was a prerequisite when everything that you hated was going on. But there were only a few people of courage to stand up and talk about it, and this is what brought about the 60s. And here you are today, standing up, talking about it, but I want to hear one more thing. All of us or none of us, let's hear it. All of us or none of us. And an injury to one is an injury to all. An injury to one is an injury to all. Okay, we're not going to take it anymore. We have to be inclusive, and I'm going to give you a clue as to what's coming down the pipe next. We have malnutrition. We're going to have hunger. Because the economy has been so mismanaged by